This video will explore civil rights, focusing on the meaning of equality under the law and historical context of civil rights.
Civil rights are the rights and privileges guaranteed by the government under the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendments. The idea that individuals are protected from discrimination based on inherent characteristics such as race, religion, national origin, and sex. The Privileges and Immunities Clause adds protections also. Civil rights are the legal protections that prevent the government or private entities, like employers or landlords, from treating you differently based on your inherent characteristics, individual characteristics that are part of a person's nature, such as race, religion, national origin, and sex. Because you cannot change your race, age, or national origin, the law protects those characteristics to ensure you have equal access to society. It is important to remember that rights are not absolute. Both civil liberties and civil rights have limits. The Supreme Court established that individual freedoms must always be balanced against the collective good and public safety. The government is allowed to treat people differently if there is a valid reason. This can be justified by a rational basis, such as age limits for driving, or a compelling interest, like restricting voting rights for convicted felons in some states. Courts use 3 judicial tests for discrimination: strict, heightened, and ordinary scrutiny. For suspect classifications like race, ethnic origin, or religion, the strict scrutiny test is used, assuming the law is unconstitutional unless the government proves otherwise. This strict scrutiny test is used for suspect classifications. The government must show that differential treatment is necessary to achieve a compelling public interest. Heightened or intermediate scrutiny is applied in sex-based discrimination cases. The government must show that the differential treatment is substantially related to an important public interest. The ordinary scrutiny test, also known as the rational basis test, requires governments to show that differential treatment is a rational way to achieve a legitimate public interest. This applies to things like age discrimination for certain activities. Americans are now aware of invidious discrimination exercised on the basis of sexual orientation and identity, and against women through sexual harassment. The Constitution implicitly endorsed inequality in 1787 through mechanisms like the 3/5 Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause. Early abolitionism, driven by religious and humanitarian groups, gained momentum by the mid-1800s. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. By the mid-1600s, laws established chattel slavery, making it a permanent heritable condition based on race, replacing the indentured servitude model. Legislative attempts at balance included the Missouri Compromise, 1820, an attempt to keep the balance of power by regulating slavery in newly acquired Western territories. Civil disobedience. Both black and white dissenters engaged in civil disobedience. The nonviolent refusal to comply with immoral laws. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to the North and Canada. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required the return of runaway slaves. The path to the Civil War in the 1850s saw the destruction of the middle ground between North and South. This period was marked by events that brought the brutality of slavery to the doorstep of free citizens. The precarious balance of the mid-19th century was shattered by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Before this law, many Northerners could ignore the reality of slavery because it was geographically distant. The act changed that overnight by legally compelling citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. It stripped alleged fugitives of the right to a jury trial and turned ordinary citizens into deputized slave catchers. For the first time, slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was a federal mandate that forced the North to be complicit in the machinery of bondage. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 provided the emotional spark. The novel personalized the horrors of slavery, hardening Northern public opinion and transforming abolitionism into a moral imperative. As the cultural divide widened, the Supreme Court attempted to settle the issue once and for all with a legal hammer. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered a ruling by declaring that African Americans could never be citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories, striking down the Missouri Compromise. For the North, this confirmed fears of a slave power conspiracy at the highest levels of government. For the South, it was a legal victory that they felt the North refused to respect. The breaking point was the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln's victory without a single Southern electoral vote led to secession. South Carolina led the march, transforming political conflict into open war. The Civil War ended slavery on the battlefield, but the Constitutional Revolution of Reconstruction was needed for permanent legal change. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 was a strategic military move, freeing slaves only in seceding states. Once the war ended, the government realized that a simple proclamation was not enough to secure permanent freedom. This led to the rapid passage of 3 Reconstruction Amendments that fundamentally altered the Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and ensured due process and equal protection. The 15th Amendment decreed that every man has the right to vote, regardless of color. The Reconstruction era, 1866 to 1877, was a brief period of progress where African Americans held significant political office, protected by federal troops. During the era known as Reconstruction, the federal government enforced these new rights aggressively. Free men, formerly enslaved people, not only voted but were elected to office in significant numbers. The South resisted with black codes, laws designed to recreate slavery in all but name. Congress struck back with the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1872. The promise of Reconstruction ended in 1877 with the withdrawal of federal troops. Southern states immediately began a systematic rollback of rights, establishing Jim Crow laws to enforce strict racial separation. Segregation took 2 forms. De jure segregation in the South meant separation by explicit law. De facto segregation in the North meant separation enforced through housing discrimination and social custom, without explicit laws. To maintain Jim Crow laws, Southern states targeted the African American vote. They implemented voter suppression tactics that were technically race-neutral, but discriminatory in practice. Suppression tactics included the following. Poll taxes required a fee to vote, effectively disenfranchising poor sharecroppers. Literacy tests were subjective exams administered by white registrars designed to fail black voters regardless of their education. White primaries banned black voters from the only elections that mattered in the one-party South. To ensure these tactics didn't accidentally hurt poor white voters, states enacted grandfather clauses, which exempted anyone whose ancestors had voted before 1867, a date when black men were still enslaved. The Supreme Court legitimized discrimination. In the civil rights cases, 1883, they ruled Congress could not prevent private discrimination. This culminated in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, establishing the separate but equal doctrine, which lasted for 58 years. Federal, state, and local governments enforced housing segregation nationwide, not just in the South until 1970. The Federal Housing Administration prohibited African American and Hispanic families from buying homes in suburbs, preventing them from accumulating wealth. Redlining was a practice where the government designated specific neighborhoods for whites only, restricting black homeowners to designated black neighborhoods. These discriminatory practices were formally outlawed by the 1968 Fair Housing Act, although enforcement issues persist.
This concludes Part 1 of Civil Rights. Part 2 will examine the modern civil rights movement, starting with the early decades of the 20th century, and African Americans continuing the struggle for equal protection under the law.